Okay, slide 13. Key terms, constructs. Very important in the social behavioral sciences. They're theoretical abstractions. We often cannot directly observe them. For instance, you can directly observe triglycerides if you do a blood draw under a microscope. You can directly observe heart rate. You can directly observe bone density. You cannot directly observe motivation. We call it's a theoretical abstraction. We know it exists. We know it by what it predicts and what it's related to. But in the social sciences, in sport and exercise psychology, constructs are again theoretical abstractions, often inferred by what they're related to. Conceptual and operational definition. Well, let me give you some examples of constructs before I move on. Motivation is one. Intrinsic motivation is another. Intelligence is a construct. Mental imagery is a construct. I study mental imagery with athletes and mostly exercisers now, and we're getting to the point where we can almost observe mental imagery using functional magnetic resonance imagery. We don't know what the content of these are, but we know that mental imagery is associated with certain functions in the brain, certain regions of the brain being more active than others, particularly the occipital lobe and the visual cortex. But we don't necessarily, we can see that these regions are more active when people imagine something, but we don't know what the content of those images are. That would be like the holy grail of the social and behavioral sciences. So when we study mental imagery, we know it exists. We know that people imagine things like their goals, their behaviors. People might imagine a task that they have upcoming, or how they're going to solve a math problem. We know these things exist. We don't know the content. So they're theoretical abstractions again. It's something that we make up as humans. We know exists. We know that they're related to certain things. For instance, we know that mental images of someone suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder are often of some traumatic event they experienced in the past. Okay, so moving on, conceptual and operational definitions. We're going to answer the difference between these in the following slides. Okay, slide 14, I covered all this about independent and dependent variables. And slide 15, I have examples of that. Okay, these are a little out of order here. I apologize. I'm going to skip slide 16 and go right to slide 17, conceptual and operational definitions. Conceptual definitions are dictionary definitions. So if I'm going to study motivation, I better have a definition of that. I better know what it means. You need to come up with some definitions, examples of conceptual definitions for yourself. The key difference between a conceptual and an operational definition is that operational definitions are basically how you're going to measure it. So for instance, if we take motivation, there is a very good way to define motivation that I already provided to you in the first part of this presentation, and that has to do with the needs, the basic functions of motivation. Now there's a better definition of that out there, but those are basically dictionary definitions. Operational definitions are associated with how you measure motivation. So for instance, I use the exercise motivation scale. It's based on self-determination theory. It's a 32-item questionnaire that asks respondents to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how strongly they agree or disagree with each question. And at the end of that, you add up the scores on those Likert scale items, and you have a number. The higher the number, you actually apply an algorithm, and you can determine how intrinsically or extrinsically motivated someone is. And it'll give you a self-determination theory index. But nevertheless, the exercise motivation scale is the operational definition of motivation from a self-determination theory perspective. Proceeding to slide 18, conceptualizations or conceptual definitions are abstractions articulated with words that aid in understanding. For instance, develop a conceptual definition of physical activity and then propose a way to operationalize it. Okay, physical activity, if you want to conceptually define it, could be any movement that occurs during one's daily life It could be deliberate, intended to increase one's fitness, or it could be lifestyle based, such as bringing in the groceries, doing chores, walking to class, etc. So those are a really rudimentary conceptual definition. That is a very rudimentary conceptual definition of physical activity. Now, how do I measure it? Well, in Unit 1, I provided examples of way to measure physical activity using the beeper-sized device called an accelerometer. It's one way to measure physical activity. There are a lot of surveys out there that are used to measure physical activity. Going back to the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, they have several questions that are essentially survey questions or interview questions, since it's administered over the phone, that is a way to operationalize physical activity. Slide 19. Conceptual definitions. Many concepts have no empirical basis. For instance, we can't directly observe intelligence. Now, give scientists time with scanning technologies. Maybe someday we will be able to look inside a human brain and say this is an intelligent person. We can't do that now. So we observe manifestations of intelligence. Now, you can apply intelligence to sport. We know that some athletes have more intelligence, or they're more intelligent with regard to their sport than others. So we can observe manifestations of intelligence by what it predicts. So, for instance, sometimes, not always, but there is a correlation, there is an association between intelligence and income. But it doesn't necessarily mean that intelligence causes increases in income. Again, they're related to one another. But we can say that intelligence also predicts scores on the GRE exam, or the SAT exam, or how you're going to do on quiz 2. Now, again, intelligence predicts things with varying degrees of success. So we can develop a very clear conceptual definition of intelligence and then operationally define it by how people score on a standardized test, for instance. Okay, so concepts or conceptualizations in sport behavior and performance, or in sport and exercise psychology, things we're interested in. We might be interested in a whole range of physical indicators. Physical indicators are probably easier to measure than psychological indicators, but things like strength, fitness, speed, performance, agility, those things can be pretty readily measured in a laboratory setting or in a gym. Psychological indicators might include pre-competition anxiety or confidence. Generally speaking, we measure those with surveys. Defining these and measuring these are separate processes, okay, but they're very highly interrelated. And so we can measure all of these things to a different degree, and we have measured. For instance, anxiety can be measured with the Competition Sport Anxiety Inventory 2, pre-competition anxiety. Confidence can be measured by the trait or the state sport confidence inventory. Strength, speed can all be measured very readily as well. Proceeding to slide 21 and moving very rapidly through the second part of this video presentation, which, as I speak right now, it is now uploaded on YouTube. Right as I speak. Isn't that cool? I just uploaded it on YouTube. And I'm going to be sending you a note that this is what I'm doing on a Friday night, sitting here recording this beautiful lecture. I just had the mood struck me, and then I realized also you have a quiz in 5 days, so this might help you, and I want to help you. Okay. So, where am I now? All right. The case of anxiety. Conceptually, and this is again your dictionary definition, this is something that psychologists generally agree that anxiety is characterized by worry or perceived threat of an impending situation. Okay? That's a very rough example. I mean, you could probably find a much better example of anxiety or definition of anxiety out there, but I'm just using that as an example. It does allow us to predict things with varying success, things like heart rate, worry, and performance on basic motor tasks. So for instance, we know that anxiety is, some people are more anxious than others. We know also that here's a good thing to think about going into quiz 2. College students, approximately 20-25% of college students nationwide report that they experience test anxiety to the point where it's somewhat debilitating on their performance. Think about that for a little while before you take quiz 2. So it could predict test performance. But for instance, if you were to do a basic motor task, let's say throwing a dart with your non-dominant hand, if you're right-handed, throwing a dart with your left hand, you might, I would hypothesize, you'd be able to predict performance based on lower anxiety scores. So in other words, someone who's more anxious prior to performing that task would probably perform less well than someone who's less anxious. Okay, so again, anxiety does predict things. We can't directly observe it. We can measure it with self-report and infer its existence based upon, let's say, performance on that basic motor task. So conceptual definitions go into 23. This is a little abstract stuff, but I want you to think about this with regard to your projects and particularly with regard to critical analysis of research article, which is due on 7-1. Okay, that is worth 100 points. That the first one and then the second one is worth 100 points too. Okay, so conceptual definition do not give us a means of measuring a construct. However, operational definitions oftentimes specify exactly what we need to measure something. So for instance, scores on the Competitive Sport Anxiety Inventory 2, or the Sport Anxiety Scale, which is another measure of anxiety, will be your operational definition of anxiety. It would be preceded by a conceptual definition of anxiety. So for instance, if you look up some of the classic articles about the Competitive Sport Anxiety Inventory 2, there's a whole book written about the development of that instrument. It's a survey by Rainer Martens, Robin Veely, Damon Burton, I believe are the authors. It was published in the early 1990s. In that book, they go to great lengths defining anxiety, and then they go to great lengths telling the world how they developed the CSAI-2, this Competitive Sport Anxiety Inventory 2. So the conceptual definition is in that book, and then scores on the CSAI-2 are your operational definition. Operational definition allow for comparisons, okay, and that's important because I can show that subgroups of athletes are more anxious prior to competition than other groups of athletes. Okay, I can demonstrate that empirically, and if you look up that book that I told you about by Rainer Martens, Robin Veely, and Damon Burton, you will find a lot of normative data, and you will see that certain subgroups of athletes are higher in anxiety than others. And that's all I'm going to say about slide 24. Going to slide 25. The only problem with operational definitions, particularly in the sport and exercise psychology, it's different if you use different instruments. So for instance, your score on the sport anxiety scale versus your score on the competitive sport anxiety scale 2 are going to mean slightly different things. You can't always compare them, and this raises issues. So the choice of instruments you use, let's say for your final research proposal, is very important. It should be logically based. It's not an easy decision to make, and I'm here to help you with that. So basically, that's the end of my presentation for Unit 2, but I want to reiterate what I just said. I'm here to help you. In other words, I'm here for you. Okay, I'm here for you. I'm your instructor. SCP-474, I'm here for you. Okay, please bear with me. This is like my only form of entertainment on a Friday night, other than my 2 cats and my dog. So, hope you enjoyed this, hope it was helpful, and I hope to hear from you.